video game remakes. Some are one-to-one, faithful recreations that stay true to their original counterparts. Others keep the same general framework, but are unafraid to deviate with expanded content, stylistic changes, and the introduction of modern game mechanics. Both the safer and more experimental approaches have their pros and cons, so one has to wonder, what makes a good remake? How's it going everyone, and welcome back to the Loading Zone, where today we're going to be talking about video game remakes, the purposes they serve, the differences they might have from their original counterparts, and what some of my favourite examples are. We've got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to begin with one that I started playing recently, which is Metroid Zero Mission. Now, I'd been meaning to get into the Metroid series for a long time, and I really didn't know where to start. Of course, you have the very first Metroid game on the NES, you got Super Metroid, and you got Metroid Prime. All of these are very fondly looked back on, but when it comes to the original game specifically, it was very brutal, very difficult, and in some ways kind of outdated. Despite that, I thought it would be a shame not to play through this series from the top, but that's where Zero Mission comes in, which is a remake of the original on the GBA using Metroid Fusion's engine. It has been completely revamped when compared to the original, and while it's undeniably the same game, the changes made really add up to the point where it feels like a completely different experience. Even from a visual point of view, all of the backgrounds have been redone to have a lot more detail, because in the original version, there were a lot of black voids and nondescript locations, whereas they have been very fleshed out in Zero Mission. I did mention that the original was pretty unforgiving when it came to its difficulty, and while Zero Mission is still a difficult game, no doubt, it has been toned down quite a bit to be a lot more newcomer friendly, which, as a newcomer to the series and Metroidvanias as a whole actually, is something that I really appreciated. The main difference that was made to modernize this game is the addition of actual save rooms like the rest of the Metroid games. As I've learnt by playing through this game, it is always important to regularly save everything you do in a Metroid game because it is so easy to get overconfident and die as a result. In the original Metroid on the NES, if you died you were given a password and you had to re-enter that password to load your progress. It was quite a long-winded system and one that's very dated by today's standards. So Zero Mission introducing these new save rooms was a great call. These save rooms weren't the only changes made to the map though, as it wasn't a complete one-to-one recreation. There were a lot of extra rooms and hidden passageways added in this game, which made for a much more intricate and non-linear experience. There were a lot of hidden items added into Discover, which really emphasizes that feeling of exploration that you'd expect from a Metroidvania. The rewards you got were definitely worth going out of your way for, because they added in a lot of power-ups that weren't in the original Metroid game, but were in future entries. Things like the charge beam, the power grip, the speed booster, the super missiles. Just having these new tools at your disposal that you wouldn't have had before to allow you to access new parts of the world by opening new doors or breaking specific types of blocks like the speed booster ones. It's just really satisfying. They even went out of their way to put in a brand new area for this remake, so it just goes to show how much effort was put into it. They also added in the ability to aim diagonally, and you actually have a map in this one, which is something you do not have access to in Metroid for the NES. I'm sure there are going to be some people who prefer the toughness that the original brings, the challenge, but me personally, I see this as a great way to revitalize the first game for a newer audience who the original might not be as palatable to. And I mean, hey, for the people who do love the original more than anything, beating Zero Mission grants you access to it, so knock yourself out. You can still play through that one in Zero Mission itself. As far as other remakes on the GBA go, you've also got Pokémon Fire Red and Leaf Green, which I consider to be the definitive way to play through the Kanto region, but I have talked about those games on an earlier installment of the podcast about GBA games and some of the finest offerings on the Game Boy Advance, so go ahead and listen to that if you want. But I think it would be a disservice of me to talk about Pokémon remakes and not mention Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver on the Nintendo DS. Now, these are considered by a lot of fans to be the best Pokémon games of all time, and I can definitely see why after having played through them now. For starters, no pun intended, they are based on Pokemon Gold and Silver, so they already have a solid foundation to build off. And much like in Metroid Zero Mission, HeartGold and SoulSilver aren't just one-to-one recreations, they offered a lot of expansions from the originals. I think these games are just generally so loved because of how much content there is. It's one of the few installments in the Pokemon franchise where you have 2 regions in one game. Once you play through the whole of Johto, get all the gym badges, beat the champion, you get access to the entirety of Kanto as well, which is insane. It's almost like 2 games in one, and they're both tied together with the story as well, because the plot interlinks the 2 regions with Team Rocket. And speaking of Team Rocket, another thing that makes these games so beloved is your rival Silver. Unlike a lot of other Pokemon rivals who tend to be very upbeat, happy-go-lucky, friendly people, Silver is almost the opposite of that when you first meet him. He is a straight-up criminal and a thief who mistreats his team and doesn't care about the bond between a trainer and their Pokemon. Of course, he develops more as the game goes on, but he just stands out so much as a rival because of how he's introduced and how unique his personality is. But that's not even getting into the extra stuff that they added in these remakes, because for one, you can catch pretty much all the Pokemon from Gens 1 to 4. Outside of specific Wi-Fi events and trading, I think there's over 400 Pokemon you can catch, so there's a wide variety of teams you can build. And of course, with those new Pokemon come the new mechanics that they brought along in Gens 3 and 4. These are often things that we take for granted in modern Pokemon games, but having abilities, natures, the physical special split in Johto is so cool. The split in particular is such a fantastic change, because Pokemon that were previously limited by their stats, like for example Sneasel, who's an ice type but a physical attacker, can now unleash their full potential thanks to the fact that some ice type moves are actually now physical while some stay special. There were just a ton of extra features added to, like a whole expanded Safari Zone with different area tiles that you could customize it with. There was the Pokeathlon, which was effectively the Olympics for Pokemon and had mini games like hurdles, relay races, and breaking blocks. It was just an all-around good time and a fun distraction from the rest of the game. You could pick up an item called the Game Boy Sound, which would allow you to switch back to the original music, the chip tunes, for a more nostalgic feeling, and that's a trend that we see in quite a few future remakes, not just in the Pokemon franchise, but in gaming as a whole, so something to bear in mind there. HeartGold and SoulSilver are also known for having some of the most post-game content out of any Pokemon games, like how they had the Battle Frontier, the Gym Leader and Elite Four rematches, all of the legendaries that you could catch, including both box legends being Ho and Lugia. Because say you were playing HeartGold, you'd catch Ho as part of the story, but in the post-game you could go and then catch Lugia as well, so it was cool to be able to have both. I think it would be wrong of me not to address the elephant in the room as well, which is the fact that you could have the first Pokemon in your party following you, and that was such a cute feature that was absent for way too long in the future entries, but is thankfully back now. The fact that they made all these new sprites for every single Pokemon in the game shows that such a great degree of care was put into these remakes. Of course, despite the fact that HeartGold and SoulSilver are often put on a pedestal by fans, they aren't perfect games, as they do have a couple of flaws. A lot of this stems from issues with the original Gold and Silver games, but there were things that could have easily been fixed in the remakes. The most glaring issue is the level curve, because it requires you to grind a lot, especially towards the end of the game with the Elite Four on the champion fight, because you'll find that your team is quite underleveled with how short Johto as a region is and how quickly you get through it, how low level the wild Pokemon are in the earlier routes, so it just takes a long time to get your team members up to scratch with where they need to be. It's a bit frustrating when you go back to Kanto as well, because you find all these new Pokemon that you hadn't seen before, but their levels are so low to the point where you just question, is it even worth training them up? I don't think these are issues that should be looked past or swept under the rug, but for me personally, they didn't massively affect my enjoyment of the games, and were just a small damper on an otherwise fantastic set of Pokemon games. Now, another remake on the Nintendo DS, which is a lot more divisive, quite a bit more polarizing than the ones I've discussed thus far, is Super Mario 64 DS. This was a launch title for the DS and was designed to showcase how powerful it was and demonstrate the idea that a little handheld can now run a game as massive as Super Mario 64. The idea was there, and the concept was solid, but there was one small issue, and that's the fact that the Nintendo DS does not have an analog stick. This meant that to control your characters in this game, you'd either have to use a D-pad, which isn't ideal for navigating a 3D space, or the touchscreen, which isn't ideal, full stop. So some would argue that perhaps they should have waited for the 3DS with this one, and I can't say that I disagree, but at the same time, I don't think Mario 64 DS is a bad remake at all. In fact, I think it succeeds in a lot of different ways. Visually, for example, the game has been upgraded very significantly, and one of the biggest places that you can see this is with the character models, because they look a lot closer to their actual designs than the N64 ones did. This is particularly noticeable with Mario and Bowser, who looked kind of blocky, kind of janky in Super Mario 64, but in DS, they look fantastic. They look exactly how the artwork shows. It's not just the graphics and controls that were changed though, as the game was massively expanded upon. As I'm sure many of you know, Super Mario 64 on the N64 had 120 stars, but on the DS, they added 30 extra ones for a total of 150. This was done through the addition of brand new levels, brand new areas, so they had a little beach reminiscent of Super Mario Sunshine, they added a whole extra bit to Big Boo's haunts, and even in Peach's castle there were some really cool changes made, like how there was a whole expanded area where the slide room would normally be. And then you could also pick up a Vanish Flower and go through the mirror. That to me as a kid was just the most mind-blowing thing. You could even go through the door on the other side of the mirror, and that would put you in this completely white, empty void where there was just a star waiting for you. It was so weird, so strange, but I loved it all the same. The new content didn't stop at just stars though, as one of the game's biggest selling points was all of the new playable characters that they added in. On top of playing as Mario, in Super Mario 64 DS, you actually started out as Yoshi, and later down the line you were able to unlock Luigi and Wario. All four characters had different abilities, like Yoshi could eat enemies, lay eggs, do a flutter jump, Mario had access to his signature wall kick of course, Luigi was the most broken character of all time because he had this super overpowered backflip which put him into a spin afterwards, and you could effectively cheese entire platforming sections with that. He also had a mini hovering jump, and for some reason they gave him the ability to run on water for a bit. Now I'm not sure why Luigi's able to do that, but hey, it's canon now. Wario is probably the least practical character in the game to use because he's slower and he can't jump as high as the rest, but he is able to break these black blocks that no other characters can, and he is supposed to be the strongest of the bunch. Sometimes the game actually required you to use these different characters for different missions, because unlike in Mario 64 where the wing cap, invisibility cap, and the metal cap were all in different boxes, in this game all of the boxes give you a power flower, but depending on which character you play as, it gives you a different power up. So if you're playing as Mario, you get the wing cap, if you're playing as Luigi, you get the vanish cap, and if you're playing as Wario, you get the metal cap. So it means that you kind of have to use all of the different characters, and you get a feel for how each one plays through that. In the Nintendo 64 version, you also had Mips the rabbit, who you had to chase down and catch, and often you'd get a star for doing so. But in the DS remake, each character has their own different coloured Mips, so there's red ones for Mario, green ones for Luigi, and yellow ones for Wario, something along those lines. And the bonuses that you get for finding these guys are, in my opinion, so good. What I'm referring to here is the minigame collection, which was also featured in New Super Mario Bros. DS, I believe, although there were some differences between the two games. In Mario 64 DS, each of the four characters had their own set of minigames, so Yoshi's were more puzzle-based, Mario's were more action-orientated, Wario's required a bit more skill, and Luigi's, for some reason, are all set in a casino and involve gambling. This was such a fun way to kill time, and some of these minigames were genuinely really addictive. I remember Wanted was one of my favourites, where you had to find a certain character's face in a sea of other faces and you only had a limited time to do so. There was one where you had to sort red and black bob-ombs into different sides of a room. There was one where you had to play ice hockey with spiny shells. It was just such a good time. With handheld consoles generally having a more pick-up-and-play style of gameplay, it makes sense as to why these minigames were included, but together they could almost be a whole game in themselves. They're that good, I'm telling you. Continuing the trend of Nintendo 64 games that were remade for a handheld, the next two that I'm going to talk about are The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D and Star Fox 64 3D, both of course on the 3DS. In a similar vein to Mario 64 before them, they were designed to showcase the power of the 3DS, but unlike Super Mario 64 DS, they were a lot more faithful to the originals. Apart from the massive visual overhauls, the original games here were mostly left intact. Ocarina of Time did something pretty neat by having the Master Quest included from the Wind Waker bonus disc, and it also introduced a boss rush mode which you could access by interacting with Link's bed and effectively reliving his nightmares. Your gear, items and maps are all on the touchscreen now, so you can access them a lot quicker, and what is arguably the best change that they possibly could have made, the iron boots are now an equipable item like any other, which makes the water temple a lot less frustrating. You could also aim your slingshot, your bow and arrow, or change the camera angle with the gyro controls, which again, pretty handy feature. Ultimately, these were just minor tweaks in the grand scheme of things, but they were pretty undisputably changes for the better. On top of having the option to use gyro controls like in Ocarina of Time 3D, Star Fox 64's remake did have a few other changes as well. For one, all of the characters had new voice lines recorded from the ground up, and some of these are the same voice actors as before, whereas some of them are new ones. I think it was sweet that they decided to do this rather than reuse the old compressed N64 recordings, but there is a certain charm about the original that I'll always miss. That also goes for the saving system as well, because in the original Star Fox 64 or Lilac Wars where I'm from, you weren't able to save at any point throughout the game, you just had to play through the whole thing in one sitting. Naturally for the 3DS version this was changed and you're able to do a quick save at any point between each mission. I think doing this was perfectly understandable, and I can see why people would consider this to be the definitive way to play the game for that reason, but there was something special about having to play through the whole thing in one go, and it always made you get completely invested in the storyline every time you wanted to play through. I also have to give credit to Star Fox 64 3D for the shortcuts they added for somersaults and U-turns, because in the original version they were quite a pain to pull off. You had to do a pretty complex button input with the C buttons and Z or something or other, but now they're just mapped to the D-pad. It is so much more convenient and makes dogfights a lot more fun. Now, while the Star Fox franchise as a whole is one that I am very familiar with, there exist remakes of other games from franchises that I have very limited experience with. Two examples of these would be the Spyro Reignited and Crash n-sane trilogies, which not only released on PlayStation, but also on the Nintendo Switch. I think this demonstrates another purpose that remakes can serve, because not only can they be a clean slate, a fresh reboot of an IP like both of these games were, but they can also introduce new players to a series who'd never played the previous games. I knew both Spyro and Crash were popular platformers from the PS1 era, but I had no idea about the finer aspects of each one, and now having played both, I've noted that Spyro is a lot more relaxing, exploration-based and more adventure-focused, whereas Crash tends to be a lot more stressful and involves more precision platforming. Of the two, I vibed with Spyro more and played a lot more of that trilogy, but I'm sure I'll get around to properly giving Crash a go at some point. Spyro is just your typical 3D platformer collectathon, and if you guys know me, I am absolutely in love with those. In terms of the changes from the PS1 games, I mean, the graphics speak for themselves. This was a huge glow up, and now there's also full camera controls, because on the PS1 you didn't have analog sticks to work with, you had a D-pad and two shoulder buttons, and that was as good as you were gonna get. The animations, which already had a lot of character before, have been made even more expressive, they look so bouncy, all of the dragons you rescue in the first game have unique designs and new dialogue, and rather than all being separate games, of course them being part of one collection makes them all feel a lot more cohesive. Reignited also does a similar thing to Pokémon HeartGold and SoulSilver by allowing you to swap between the new and the old OSTs, which, for fans of the original games, is such a nice touch. Toys for Bob really knocked it out of the park here, and I can only hope that one day the Banjo-Kazooie franchise gets the same treatment. I would love to see remakes of Kazooie and Tooie on a modern platform. That's the dream, and then hopefully we'd get a Banjo 3 afterwards. Full disclosure, this transition was completely impromptu. I did not intend for this to happen. But speaking of dreams, Link's Awakening on the Nintendo Switch is another remake that I find to be very, very charming. The thing that sticks out to me the most about it is, of course, its art style, because they went for a toy-like aesthetic with this one, and I find that to be so cute, and it brings the old sprite work to life. It feels like the vision that the developers had when they made the Game Boy version was finally realised here, and of course that shows in the overworld as well. Rather than the map being effectively a set of scrolling tiles like in the original, it's now one completely seamless world. They also made a lot more quality of life changes in a similar vein to this, like with the controls. On the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, you only really had an A button and a B button, whereas the Switch and modern consoles in general have 4 face buttons and shoulder buttons too. So by default, the sword is mapped to B, and the shield and Pegasus boots are mapped to the shoulder buttons, and this frees up X and Y to be used for all of the other items. You do have to switch up your inventory quite a bit in dungeons to solve certain puzzles or beat certain enemies, so that's been made a lot more painless here. As you'd expect, the extra content that was in Link's Awakening DX on the Game Boy Color was also added back in, like the optional color dungeon which you could beat to get the red tunic and the blue tunic to boost your attack or defense. They even added in a brand new dungeon creator with Dampe, and it's just a lot of small changes that add up to vastly improve the game. As someone who is a pretty big Zelda fan but didn't get to experience this one when it first came out, being able to finally play this game in this form was such a cool experience. The Zelda series is no stranger to having its games remade, as we've already discussed with Ocarina of Time today, but another one that was on the Switch, although I'd consider it to be more of a remaster than a remake, is The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. For those unaware, Skyward Sword is my favourite Zelda game of all time. Controversial take, I know, but I just love it so much. People do have their fair share of gripes and criticisms about it, but the great thing about Skyward Sword HD is that despite it appearing as a simple up-res and upscale job, it actually addressed a lot of the issues that fans had. One of the biggest things that put people off Skyward Sword in the first place were the motion controls, which I never found to be too bad, but that's a whole separate argument in itself. Now though, instead of being mandatory, they've been made optional, so rather than swinging your sword around with the Wii Remote, you can use the right stick instead, and this also applies for anything else that uses the Wii Remote, like strumming the harp or riding the Loftwing, because now you can control the flying like a normal person instead of waving the Wii Remote up and down like in the original. People also hated Fi for how intrusive she used to be. She was arguably even worse than Navi with how often she'd pop out, but that's been toned down a lot. It makes the opening especially feel way more streamlined, and that's bolstered by the fact that you can skip the cutscenes too. Another thing is that back on the Wii, every time you reloaded your file and picked up a new item, you would have to see the pop-up and read the text every single time that happened, whereas in Skyward Sword HD, the text only displays the first time you pick up an item, so hey, props for that. It is definitely the best way to experience Skyward Sword, and I would encourage you to give it a shot if you haven't already. It allows people to finally enjoy what makes this game so great without being bogged down by all the bloatedness from before. It's interesting, the Switch has been getting more and more of these remasters over time, like recently we've just had the Metroid Prime remaster and the Pikmin 1 and 2 remasters. These are all GameCube games that were touched up a little bit visually and had some minor quality of life changes made, and with those minor alterations, they just feel like modern games again. F-Zero GX absolutely deserves the same treatment, by the way. That needs to happen. I will not rest until I see F-Zero GX HD on the Nintendo Switch or Nintendo Switch 2, whatever it is by the time this podcast is out. In all seriousness, I'm glad that a lot of the bangers from the GameCube's library are being revived for a new generation to experience, because that console had such a wide variety of incredible games from all of Nintendo's franchises. And hey, not too long ago, Nintendo pulled a very unexpected move by showing off a brand new remake of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, which is wild to me. I never thought they'd go back to that game, but here we are. I was convinced Nintendo was done with classic Paper Mario and just the old style of Mario RPGs as a whole, but once again, that theory was completely shattered by Super Mario RPG's release on the Nintendo Switch. That one in particular had me so pumped because it wasn't on the Nintendo Switch Online subscription service, and I didn't get to play it on the SNES, so I've been having a great time with it so far, and I'll let you know my thoughts when I've played a bit more of it. I feel like I've talked about a lot of different games today, but there are many other remakes that I haven't had a chance to play myself. Things like Resident Evil 2, Final Fantasy VII, Fire Emblem Echo, Shadow of Valentia. Like I said, there's a lot, and I'm sure we'll get around to playing them someday because I have heard great things. Regardless, that's going to be it for today's installment of the Loading Zone podcast, so thank you guys so much for listening. I really hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one.